Hello everyone, Bachphotography here with a video all about composition and how you can improve your composition to take better portraits and better photos in general. My first tip particularly relates to portraits, but really any sort of photography that has a main focus as the subject, and that is to make sure that your subject fills the entire frame of your photo and you don't have too much negative space surrounding them. Now this is so that it is obvious to your viewer what is the subject of the image, and you're also filling up all the available space with the thing that is interesting in the photo. The next tip is for portrait photography, and it's to have your subject always facing inward into the frame. So you don't want to have your subject positioned looking outward, out of the frame, because you want the photo to be the main focus. You want everything in the photo to be telling the story, and you don't want it to look like there might be something interesting going on outside of the frame. You can see the difference in these two photos where we've put the model in a position that is looking into the photo and out of the photo, and the one looking out of the photo is way more jarring, and you can use that as a technique, but in general you want your model or your subject to be looking into the frame. Another composition mistake a lot of people make is not having enough depth in their image. And what I mean by that is not having enough things that are way in the background, or even things that are in the foreground as well. Because particularly when you're shooting at low apertures, having things really far in the background and really far forward in the foreground are going to make those things way more blurry and then add more separation between the things that aren't in focus and the focus of your image. You can see in these two photos as a comparison, you can see a big difference in the attention that's drawn from the focus of these images, which is Whitney, our model. Next is the height that you're shooting at when you're taking photos of something. If you're a tall guy like me, I'm about 190 centimeters, you'll find yourself often shooting models facing downward, and that means that you won't get lots of the background in the frame. Particularly at low apertures, this is going to look really beautiful and blurry in the background. So make sure that you adjust your height to suit the subject of your photo. Sometimes you'll have to look higher, sometimes you'll have to look lower, but make sure to experiment to get the right height and the right perspective for your photo. The next tip is about backgrounds and making sure that there's nothing distracting in the background taking away from the focus of your subject. So make sure that there's nothing in the way that makes it look like your subject has something coming out of them, like a tree coming out of the top of their head or something like that. And also make sure there's nothing too close to the subject that is still nicely in focus so that you can see it. Make sure that everything's clear and out of the way and there are no distracting things in the background that can be helped. Next, we want to make sure that our horizons are straight and our entire image is straight so that our subject is upright and in the right angle and the right position as well. So we want to make sure that the horizon in our photo isn't tilted so that the image feels more stable and more elegant and it doesn't feel like we're looking at anything from an angle. My next tip is to use other objects to surround the main focus of your image so it's clear to the viewer what they should be looking at. In this instance, we're using flowers to circle Kiara to make it clear that Kiara is the main focus of this photo. Just make sure that the things you're using to surround your subject aren't too overpowering and confuse the viewer as to where to look. You can see in this photo that we're shooting at really low apertures to blur out the flowers, so we're still getting a surrounding object that points to our subject that is a different color that makes it clear that Kiara is the main focus of the image without it being an obstacle to confuse the viewer in the photo. Another classic portrait mistake people make with composition is cutting off people's hands and feet in the photo and making non-obvious separations of what should be in frame and what should be out of the frame. Try to be as intentional as you can when leaving limbs in or out of your photos, and try not to cut limbs off really close to the ends, so not just hands or just feet. Try to cut arms off at the elbow or potentially legs at the knees. Next, let's talk about the space you leave above the head in a portrait. Now, you don't want to leave too much space here, but also you want to leave a little bit so that you are looking at a photo that appears to be at eye level. So don't leave a huge amount of negative space, that would be a mistake, but you want to leave at least a little bit so you can see above the person's head and they're not completely filling the frame. You can see here that having all that negative space above Anna makes her look much shorter in the frame. My next tip is to use leading lines to draw the focus of your subject from the beginning of a photo into the center where your subject is. You can see in this photo we're using this ledge here as a leading line to Riley, our model. This makes it even more obvious to the viewer where to look in your image and draws even more focus to the subject of your photo. Just make sure that your leading lines lead to the focus of your subject and don't go off in random parts of the photo, so that your viewer knows where to look and knows what the focus of your photo is. So if you're enjoying this content so far, please consider hitting that subscribe button and leaving a like as well. It really helps me in the YouTube algorithm and also helps me make as much content for you as possible when I make this a full-time job. So thank you very much for subscribing. The next tip I have for you is making sure that your subject is in focus. And this is particularly important for portraits because we want to have the eyes in focus so that our audience member can look at the photo and look at the eyes, which are going to be the first thing that your audience member looks at. This next tip, in my opinion, is the most important tip of the entire video, and that is to slow down and really be thoughtful with your composition and where you're placing your camera and where you're placing the subject of your photo. Now finally, before we go into Photoshop and have a look at how we can solve some of these simple problems in our portraits, remember that all of these tips and tricks can be broken and be used as stylistic choices to make your images look edgy or just add a little bit of a different look to your photos. So now let's jump into Photoshop and have a look at some of the ways we can fix some of these problems with composition in post-production. And I'm going to leave a link to all the raw files from all of the photo shoots that I've put on YouTube in the description, and all the photo shoots that you've seen in this video as well. So if you'd like to edit along with me or have some practice with editing, all of those are going to be in the description of this video. Okay, so let's start with an easy fix, and that is fixing this horizon here, which is slanted. Now we're in Photoshop, and this will work also in Lightroom. We go to the crop tool and we just move over to a position where the horizon is straight. Now, if you're cropping out parts of the image now that you don't want to crop out, we do have a few options. We can just drag out little bits like this, so we have parts of the image that we would like. And now what we have is parts of the image here which are black because they are outside of the original frame of the photo. But we actually have a few options now to add detail back into those areas and remove any of those black lines. So one thing we can do is just get the lasso tool, and we can just highlight an area like this which is black and press the delete button, and because this layer here is locked, it's going to do a content aware deletion, and as you can see here, it gets rid of that area that was black. One other thing we can do is that we can get this selection tool here, and we can use a rectangle selection tool and just make a selection of the area which is black, and then go right click, free transform, and then right click once more and click distort, and then we can just drag that area out of the frame like so. Now as you can see here, because we're only using a tiny area to distort, everything gets kind of blurry and strange. But if you're getting a bigger part of the image, so let's say instead of doing it there, we move further into the leg. Now this might not be something you want to do to make people's body parts longer, but if their leg wasn't here, we could just distort it like this and get rid of that problem like that. But in this instance, I actually think that the other way of doing things is better, which is just getting the lasso tool and just making a selection like so, and then clicking the delete button and waiting for Photoshop to fill in the area that was missing. Now, one tip I forgot to mention, which is actually really important, is if you're not sure what your composition should be, always shoot a little bit wider than you think you're going to need. Because in this photo, for example, you can see that I shot a bit further out than I maybe should have. But if I use my crop tool here, I can always make it more tight of a crop, and that's no problem at all. Now I have a tighter crop, and the image, in my opinion, looks much better. This is going to be much more difficult to do the other way, because it's easy to get rid of detail, but it's much more difficult to add detail back into the image. So if you have the choice, always make sure to shoot a little bit wider than you would expect that you need, so that you can always crop in later. Because these days, cameras are so good. They have huge megapixel sensors. For example, this camera has a 42 megapixel sensor. It gives you a lot of flexibility to crop in, but it's always going to be more difficult to crop out because you're having to add extra detail in that wasn't there previously. So that's everything for this video I have about composition, and I'd love to know what you think are some important tips and tricks for your personal composition in your photos, what helps you maintain good composition in your photos, and what things you do in your photos that maybe you shouldn't be doing. One thing that I always struggle with is chopping off hands and feet. I always chop off hands a little bit too far down or feet a little bit too far down and leave my composition looking a little bit awkward in that way. So that is something that I personally need to solve in my photos. Remember, all the photos in this photo shoot, as well as many other photos, are going to be in the description in raw form. So if you'd like to edit those in your own time, feel free to. They're all down there for you to use. And thank you to everyone who's been going onto my Instagram and sending me the edits of my photos that you've done. I really enjoy having a look at all those. So that's everything for this video. Thank you once again for watching, and I will see you in the next video coming very soon.